for the internal reproductive structures, right here you have these two organs right here are forming from the same embryonic tissue right here, and they're going to become the gonads, right? The testes of the male and the ovaries of the female. And again, these are homologous structures because they're coming from the same embryonic tissue. Right? This one, under the influence of a gene that's on the Y chromosome, becomes the testes. In the absence of that, it becomes the ovary. Right? So they have a similar embryonic origin, and they also have, in this case, kind of similar functions, right? They're both the gamete-producing organs that are producing the sex cells. They also are producing the sex hormones, right? Androgens, the testosterone, and the estrogen, in this case. Right? And they're going to be, although they start out the same, right? They're going to migrate down from around the kidneys where they start off with. Males are going to drop outside the body cavity. The female ovaries are going to nestle inside the pelvic cavity right there. Right? Then there's other structures here from these embryonic organs. You could look at the video for that, how these develop. But I mean, I'm not going to test you on the actual embryonic tissue, but these structures this is where they're coming from, okay? All right, so again, I'm going to switch back and forth between male and female, and I am perpetuating societal stereotypes by labeling the female stuff pink and the male blue, just so you're color-coded here, right? So the gonads in the females right here, right, they're nestled, again, inside. This is a cross side view of the inside of the hip, right? Here's the sacrum. Here's the inside of that iliac fossa right there. Here's the pubic symphysis. Here's the bladder right here. Here's the uterus. And then the gonads, the ovaries, are sitting right above there, right? So they're safely protected inside the pelvic cavity there. And so here's an isolated picture of those ovaries. And again, these are very distinct, right, from both the fallopian tubes, the uterine tubes, fallopian tubes, that's the same thing, and the uterus, right? They're different organs. They came from different structures, and they're not even actually physically connected, right there, the ovaries and the uterine tubes, right there. But they're sitting there very closely associated with those. And in the video, I also talk about the ligaments that are kind of securing them to that spot. All right, so there they are, right? With a little bit more context. And here we're looking at a cross section. And so there's the uterine tube up here. And this is a cross section of the ovaries right there. And your main function of your ovaries is to produce the female gametes, right? The ovum or the ova, plural. Right? And we'll talk a little bit more about the structure as we go along. Right? So they're going to have structure within them. They're going to be producing estrogen and progesterone. Right? So these are producing the eggs. They're also producing the sex hormones, right, that are going to influence all those later secondary sex characteristics as well as have other effects. So one thing we miss, and actually for any of you, when we did look at the female cadaver early on, the pelvic section, if you remember, it was like a little piece of chewed gum, basically, that ovary about the size of a walnut. That's what it looked like, at least, in a cadaver. I can't really say what it looks like otherwise, but they're paired organs. That is one on each side, about the size of a walnut. The outside of it has a visceral peritoneum, basically, because it's coming off the membrane, the peritoneal cavity. So you have this visceral peritoneum covering it. And unlike normal peritoneum, it's not a simple squamous, it's a cuboidal epithelium. So you'll see this labeled as the germinal epithelium, but it's just basically the serous membrane part of the embryo. Right? And then also, internal to that, it's got this tunica albuginea. That's a dense, irregular connective tissue covering, right, providing a little bit of a covering. And so that'll be interesting because during ovulation, it's got to bust through that tunica albuginea right there, the ovum. Right? And then internally, you got the medulla right here. Remember, just like the kidney medulla, that's on the inside right here. This is where all your blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, vessels are coming in, and that's basically the inside, this internal part of the ovary. On the outside, you have the cortex, again, like the kidney, right? The surrounding area right here. And this is where all the follicles which produce the ova will be present right there. So there we are. That's the ovary right there. And it's got those different regions to it and different structures. Again, blood vessels coming in here, supplying the blood. They're also, it's not just supplying the blood for these to live. It's going to supply hormones, right, that are going to affect the cycle of these and also pick up estrogen and progesterone that are going to be secreted by some of these structures. And we'll go over these a little bit more as we go along right here, right? But main point for our cortex here is that it's going to contain the follicles right here, which are going to contain the actual ovum. So the follicles right here are these big structures right here. And then the ova right here, right, this happy looking fella right here, right, there's the actual egg cell right here. These are all the support cells, right? And again, we'll go over this a little more over here. So that's the ovary, right? That's the female gonad that is going to produce the sex cells as well as the hormones, right? And so on this side right here is the male gonad, the testes right here. So what we'll see here, we're going to like kind of compare these two right here, right? As we go along here, this is going to be producing the male sex cells, the sperm, as well as testosterone. And so for the males, again, these are located outside the body cavity. Again, as the other video explains, this is to maintain a slightly cooler temperature than body temperature for the optimal maturation of the sperm right here, right? And so the overall structure inside the scrotal cavity right here is the testes right here, covered by the, again, a tunica albuginea, a dense irregular connective tissue covering, although in this point the sperm is not going to bust out of that. It's going to be produced in these tubules within there and travel along these tracts, right, through a different way. So these are the seminiferous tubules. You have about a quarter mile or so of tubules, or a male does, have about a quarter mile of these seminiferous tubules packed inside these, organized into these lobules, right, within the individual testes. And then what we're saying, the seminiferous tubules are going to be these tubules that are going to be producing the sperm as well as the testosterone within here, right? So here is the cross section of those tubules. And again, there's about a quarter mile of these tubules packed inside right there, right? So the seminiferous tubules are where this is a cross section right here. And then within here is for the most part, the actual sperm cells. And so this is where the production is occurring. You have those spermatogenic cells, and you also have these other two types of cells located within here, okay? So we'll go over those. So if you look at any cross section, right, this is a cross section of all those tubules, and then you have some kind of tubular capsule within each tube. It's some kind of loose connective tissue. It's not really important, but within the tubule is where you have all those sperm, different stages of sperm within there. So they're dividing, right? They're dividing a lot. And we'll get into that in a second, right? On the outside of these tubules, you have what are called the interstitial cells. And then within the tubule, you also have another type of cell called the nurse cells right here. So again, here is the testes right here with the seminiferous tubules. Here's a cross section right over here. And then this little cartoon picture is kind of a representation of a little section of that tubule right here. So here's that section again. And so when you look at most of the cells in here, what they are sperm stages at different stages of development, right? The earliest ones over here, they're dividing, and the mature ones move toward the lumen right over there, right? So they're dividing a lot, right? Anybody want to guess how many sperm cells are made in a second? Anybody want to read the screen and tell me?
1,500.
Anybody got a calculator and say, the course of this lecture is an hour? How many sperm cells are being developed in an hour? How about in a day? So it turns out you got like 500 billion, right, in a lifetime or something like that. A lot of them are made, continuously made, right? And through all these quarter mile of seminiferous tubules constantly being made, right?
About 5 million during a 1 hour lecture.
5 million, very good.
A little.
Here's just a fun fact for you. No,
I think we should definitely start giving birth control to men as opposed to women.
Absolutely. So yeah, all those are being made, and they're being made in this seminiferous tubules, and then we'll look a little later what happens to them afterwards, right? What the stages are. But in general, they go from a spermatid, they go through different stages. In the end, what you're left with is a packet of DNA, right? In the head right here, you're left with a little tail, right? So that it could swim along there at a certain point. And then you're also left with this little acrosome packet. This is going to be like digestive sort of enzymes that are going to be able to penetrate the egg, actually, to fertilize it in the end right there, as well as a couple other functions. But that's your general sperm cell, mature sperm cell. Right? So they're all being made constantly, and most of the cells in there are the sperm cells. You also have within here these nurse cells, right? And these are, they call by a couple different names, fertilized, testicular cells. And basically these are support cells. They're kind of like the astrocytes of the nervous system, right? They're supporting, they're caring for these guys. They also form a blood-sperm barrier, just like those astrocytes are help forming the blood-brain barrier. So the sperm cells are all within that capsule right here. There's a little bit of, these are fibrocytes, so this is some kind of loose connective tissue covering it. And then this blood vessels, the blood supply is outside of those, right? So any nutrients, oxygen and everything the oxygen can diffuse through, but the nurse cells are going to be just like those. They're kind of like, if you remember the glial cells that are in the choroid plexus, or if you've already forgotten those, they're basically taking the nutrients and stuff and kind of making it safe. They're making sure, very sure, that no immune cells are going to get within this space right here, right? Because immune cells can get out here, they can leave the capillary walls, but you don't want immune cells in here. Why don't you want immune cells in here? Because these cells are not recognizable by the immune system. They're all new, they have different genetics than any of your normal somatic cells, for the most part, right? So if the immune cells do get in there, they'll start attacking all these cells and killing them, right? So you want to keep a separation between the actual sperm cells and the rest of the body fluid. Here, so your blood vessels, your capillaries are all outside those tubules here, okay? Also, right outside those tubules, right here, are these interstitial cells. Interstitial meaning in between the tubules, right? And they're within this kind of more regular, like a loose connective tissue area right here. These cells are the cells that are producing testosterone. So the testosterone produced here can go into the blood cell, into the capillaries here to be circulated throughout the entire body. And again, it'll have its, especially during adolescence, it's going to have those secondary sex characteristics effects right here. And they'll also end up, the nerve cells will eventually get to them and also influence the production of the sperm itself, right? So those are the interstitial cells. They're sitting outside those tubules, secreting testosterone. So those are the three types of cells within the testes. All right, so those cells, again, they're dividing, right? The most mature cells are going to be in the middle, in the lumen, right over there. And from there, so all these tubules are packed inside there. You're going to see them go through here and then end up going out through these other ducts, right, into this comma-shaped things that is outside the testes, called the epididymis right here. So sperm is going to be produced. Immature sperm is going to be kind of pushed out here by peristalsis. It's just going to be moved around through cilia and peristalsis out here. and then it's going to mature over here. And we'll get back to the epididymis in a little bit. First, enough about males. Let's go back to the females here, right? Back to pink, go back to that ovary. And we'll talk about these follicles here, which are going to produce the ova. Right? So the ova is the actual gamete, right? The sex cell. The follicles are the support around it. Right? So going back to the males, how many sperm were being produced in a second?
1,500.
Right. So let's look at a comparison here, right? Females are going to start off, a fetal one might have 6 million. By the time it's born, there's about 1 million. By puberty, there's about 300,000 eggs produced, and that will be what a female has for life, right? About 300,000. Only about 300 to 400 are going to be ovulated. That is, become mature and released from the ovary right there, right? So does that seem fair to anybody here?
So, Professor, is that the 300 to 400 then? Is that like menstrual cycles? That's like basically what you're going to endure during a lifetime? Is that what that's
Right.
saying?
If you look at the maturity, like the reproductive age stages for a female, you know, from whenever 12, 13 to 50 or whatever the actual range is, and then the monthly cycle and all that'll be, you can calculate it based on that basically. And that's just an average or so. And that's the ones that reach full maturity and are actually undergo ovulation. So that's a cross section. Again, this whole structure, right, is the follicle, right? Isn't this a nice picture? This is from histology, right, a close-up. Right? These are the follicle cells, the support cells around the actual ovum, right here, the actual egg cell itself. And so, again, I won't really ask about the specifics of this whole follicle development and what happens here. There's just a couple of key things, right? They basically develop, and they're kind of selected. I don't really know how randomly, like out of those 300,000 that you have, why 1 or 2 or 3, or how many are selected for maturation at any one time, but some of them do. And they undergo these stages until they undergo ovulation. This is all going to be driven by hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, right? This is stimulated by the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, released into the blood and brought into the ovaries right here. This is the normal sort of cycle right here. Follicular stimulating hormone is going to kind of promote this whole maturation cycle right here, right? So the maturation, and again, when you look at these cartoons, it shows an arrow like going around the ovary. This is, you know, it's happening randomly. They're not like moving around in a circle or anything to do that. Right? They're just maturing, and they're doing it based on follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle cells are also secreting estrogen, which will, I'm not sure how much it has to do with promoting the cycle, but it also gets in the bloodstream, which is going to affect the growth and repair of the endometrium wall, which we'll talk about, part of the uterine wall. And so they're going to mature, and at some point, the mature egg is going to ovulate under the influence of luteinizing hormone surge right here, which means it's going to burst through the tunica albuginea wall and release, strangely enough, into the peritoneal cavity right here, where your uterine tubes will be there waiting to catch it, hopefully. Okay. After this cycle is done, right, that remaining follicles of those that the ovum bursts from is going to become another structure. It's going to turn into the corpus luteum eventually, right? That corpus luteum becomes a glandular cell, basically. It becomes part of the endocrine system, which is going to secrete progesterone and estrogen, right? Which is also going to have effects on the endometrium of the uterine wall. That's the corpus luteum. So those are the main ones you want to know. A follicle with the ovum in it, and I won't ask you about the particular stages, and then that corpus luteum, right, which is basically an endocrine gland at that point, secreting progesterone and estrogen. Right? So again, here's the ovary, a little more context right here. Here's the uterus. Here's the fallopian tube, right? And then it's got this little structure right here, the fimbriae, the ovum, again, burst out into space here, and then it's going to be caught by these little fingers. Okay, so again, here's the ovulation process going out again to the peritoneal cavity, and we'll talk about this. We'll get back to this after we go through. We're going to go back to the male right here, right? So here again, the male gonads with all their miles of seminiferous tubes and their 1,500 sperms per second, right, being produced. And once they're going to go again into this epididymis right here, this outside structure right here, and then eventually they're going to be moving through these, what's called the ductus deferens, or commonly known as the vas deferens right here. So sperm's going to mature. Epididymis right here, sperm's going to be made. It's going to be stored and matured in this region. It's going to take about 2 weeks. This is about actually 20 feet of tubules moving up, and then it's going to go through this vas deferens, right, which is going to go back up through the spermatic cord, right, that's going to go through the abdominal wall. As we'll see, it's going to basically move sperm around there through different mechanisms, right? So it's coming around there, then it's coming around the back. Here's the bladder right here. The ductus deferens are going to feed into these right here. So here is the sperm that was being matured. It's going to travel out those tracts, and then it's going to enter into these different regions of the urethra at that point, the shared tract, the reproductive, and the urinary, right? So the mature sperm is being pushed along here. At some point down here, it's actually going to become activated and start moving on its own. But before then, it's being pushed along through peristalsis and cilia movement, cilia currents being pushing along right there. Right? Along the way, these glands right here that are associated are going to add stuff to the mix. Right? In this case, these glands are going to add something, these glands are going to add something, and then these glands are going to add something, right? So these first glands right here are called the seminal vesicles. And this is most of the semen, or over half the semen right here, is actually this sort of fluid, right? It has a lot of fructose in it for energy. This is where sperm, again, becomes activated when it's introduced to this, the fluid within here, right here, right? So this is where the sperm is activated, actually. The next region it's going to go through is the prostate. In this case, the important thing to remember here is it makes seminal plasma, or you could remember it as just an antibiotic. It's going to produce an antibiotic right there. This is one of the nice things guys do, is prevent, it helps prevent urinary tract infections in females. So next glands down here, you got the bulbourethral glands. This is going to also produce some alkaline secretions to neutralize the urethra of urine, right? Because we got that shared tract right there, right? So all these things together are going to form semen, right? So you got the mature sperm, all these secretions, and then that makes the semen, actually. Okay, back to the female. So again, here is the ovum or ova, or the oocyte, right, being released from the ovary right here. And then this right here, right, is the uterine tube right here. So this is kind of crazy that it's actually going out not directly into that, right? There's probably some kind of covering. I don't know what this is, but this is endoscopy. So being spit out kind of into space, right? And being caught by the fimbriae right there. And in here, right, it's going to move along here in the event of fertilization. This is a region where it's going to get fertilized here. If it does, it's going to be pushed down again through peristalsis and cilia currents. It's going to be pushed down into the uterine cavity right here. And then there it would implant into the uterine wall. In the event of non-fertilization, it does keep on moving down there, and it'll just endly get shed out along with the shed. Yes, that's correct. Okay, so in the uterus, I did. So this is the uterine wall right here, and I just want to mention this before we break here. The outside layer is the perimetrium. Right? That's again the visceral peritoneum kind of structure covering the outside of the uterus. Right over here. The myometrium is a smooth muscle layer, which is going to, when it does contract, like during labor, right, it's going to help push the fetus out of the uterus right here. And then the endometrium, which you've alluded to a couple of times, is going to be a sort of endothelial and glandular type of tissue with loose connective tissue with these two sublayers right here. Right, you got a functional and a basilar layer. This functional layer is the layer that breaks down during menses, right there. Right. So what I'm going to cover this kind of stuff in more detail in the next video, so I'm not going to cover it now. But in the event of pregnancy, again, just to get an idea, again, here's the bladder, here's the uterus right here, here's all your small intestines, your stomach, your large intestine, all those tubes right here. This little thing right here in a growing baby kind of pushes up, right, so that the fundus is like pushing up against the stomach right here. Right, just grows up and takes the entire 3/4 of the room up of the abdominal cavity right there. Okay, so that's totally insane, I think. But that's what'll happen to that uterus in there.